The first rays of morning sunlight spilled across the endless Wyoming prairie, turning the sea of tall grass into waves of gold. A cool breeze drifted over the hills, carrying the scent of sagebrush, fresh earth, and horses. It was the kind of morning that made people believe God had painted the West with his own hands. Long before the little town of Willow Creek awakened, one cowboy was already at work. Ethan Walker tightened the saddle on his faithful bay horse, Ranger, before riding toward the eastern pasture. His weathered hat shaded his face from the rising sun, while his worn leather gloves showed years of honest labor. Every movement was steady and practiced. He wasted no motion, no words, and no energy. He preferred the company of cattle and open skies to noisy conversations. The ranch where he worked belonged to the Thompson family, one of the oldest ranches in the valley. Though Ethan owned very little, everyone agreed he carried himself with more dignity than many wealthy men. He was the first to arrive every morning, the last to leave every evening. If a fence needed mending, Ethan fixed it before anyone asked. If a calf wandered into danger, Ethan found it. If a neighbor lost horses during a storm, Ethan rode through rain and darkness until every animal was safely home. He never complained, never demanded praise, never expected payment beyond what he had earned. Old Ben Carter often said, "If every man worked like Ethan Walker, heaven would have fewer worries about the earth." The younger cowboys laughed whenever Ben said it. Yet none of them argued, because everyone knew it was true. As the morning stretched on, Ethan guided a group of cattle across a shallow stream. A frightened calf slipped on the muddy bank and tumbled into the rushing water. Without hesitation, Ethan urged Ranger forward. The horse splashed into the creek. Cold water soaked Ethan's boots as he leaned dangerously from the saddle, caught the terrified calf beneath its chest, and lifted it back onto solid ground. The little animal stumbled toward its mother. The older cowboys cheered. One young ranch hand shook his head. "I swear," he said, "that man doesn't know how to think about himself." Old Ben chuckled. "That's because he learned long ago that real strength isn't about yourself." Ethan heard them, but simply smiled. He wiped the water from his sleeves and continued working. That was the way he lived. Do the job. Help others. Move on. By late afternoon, the church bell echoed through Willow Creek. Saturday meant only one thing. The town square would soon fill with families preparing for Sunday's harvest celebration. Children chased each other between wooden storefronts. Merchants displayed fresh pies, quilts, carved furniture, and jars of homemade preserves. Musicians tuned fiddles beneath the shade of giant cottonwood trees. Women hurried from one shop to another, carrying baskets filled with ribbons, flour, fresh vegetables, and flowers for the church. Everyone looked forward to the gathering. Not just because of the music, not because of the food, but because Ethan Walker would almost certainly be there. Though he never sought attention, people naturally gathered around him. Some wanted his advice. Others simply enjoyed his quiet presence. He had become something of a mystery. The strongest cowboy in 3 counties. The kindest man many had ever met. Yet completely alone. Inside Harper's general store, several young women stood near the fabric counter, pretending to examine bolts of cloth. In truth, they were watching the street through the front window. "I heard Ethan helped Mrs. Dawson repair her roof yesterday," one whispered. "He spent 6 hours up there." Another sighed dreamily. "My brother said Ethan gave half his wages to the widow Miller family last winter." A third smiled. "And he never told anyone." Mrs. Harper folded a stack of blankets while listening quietly. She finally smiled. "You girls spend more time talking about Ethan than buying fabric." The young women laughed. One blushed. "Can you blame us?" "No," Mrs. Harper answered honestly. "But admiration isn't the same as knowing someone." The girls barely heard her. Outside, Ethan had just tied Ranger beside the hitching rail. Every eye followed him as he walked into town. He greeted the blacksmith first. "Afternoon, Jacob." The old blacksmith smiled. "Fence holding up?" "So far." He tipped his hat toward Mrs. Dawson carrying groceries. "Need help with those?" Before she could answer, Ethan had already picked up the heavier basket. He carried it all the way to her porch. On the way back, two little boys raced past him with homemade wooden swords. One stumbled over a loose stone. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan caught the boy before he hit the ground. "You all right there, soldier?" The child nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then carry on." The boys laughed and charged back into their imaginary battle. Parents watched with grateful smiles. Children adored Ethan because he treated them with respect, never talking down to them, never brushing them aside. Every child felt seen. By sunset, Willow Creek buzzed with excitement. Lanterns glowed along the wooden boardwalk. Families gathered in front of the church to decorate for Sunday's celebration. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. Long tables were arranged beneath the trees. Young men practiced dancing while pretending not to. Young women adjusted ribbons in one another's hair. Among them stood Margaret Collins. She wore an elegant blue dress imported from St. Louis, trimmed with delicate lace. A silver brooch sparkled at her collar, and her gloves were spotless despite the dusty streets of Wyoming. Margaret knew she was beautiful. She also knew her father owned nearly 3,000 acres of ranch land. Most men in the territory hoped for a chance to court her. Yet Margaret wanted only one man, Ethan Walker. She noticed him carrying wooden benches toward the church without being asked. Even while working, he smiled politely at everyone. Margaret turned confidently toward her friends. "This time," she declared, "he'll dance with me." Several women exchanged doubtful glances. "You've said that before." She lifted her chin. "This year will be different." The following morning dawned bright and clear. Church bells rang across the valley. Families arrived in wagons from neighboring ranches. Children wore their best clothes. Men dusted off polished boots. Women carried steaming casseroles wrapped in clean cloth. Inside the small white church, every pew slowly filled. As always, Ethan entered quietly. He removed his hat, shook hands with Pastor Samuel Reed, then sat alone in the third pew from the front, the same place. Every Sunday, no wife beside him, no children, no family, only silence. Pastor Samuel noticed, as he always did. His heart ached for the lonely cowboy, but he never pressed Ethan with questions. Some burdens could only be surrendered to God in His perfect time. After the service, laughter filled the churchyard. Music began. Children played games while adults shared meals beneath the trees. Before long, Margaret saw her opportunity. She smoothed her dress and walked directly toward Ethan. Several women discreetly stopped talking to watch. Even a few older ranchers smiled knowingly. Margaret extended her hand. "Ethan, would you honor me with the first dance?" Her voice carried just enough confidence for everyone nearby to hear. Ethan looked toward the musicians, then toward the laughing children running near the creek. A warm smile crossed his face. "I'm afraid I can't." Margaret blinked. "You can't?" "I'm watching the children." She frowned. "There are plenty of parents watching them." He gently shook his head. "Not enough near the water." Sure enough, a little girl had wandered dangerously close to the creek's slippery bank. Without another word, Ethan walked toward the children. Minutes later, the little girl nearly lost her footing while reaching for a floating flower. Ethan caught her by the arm before she could fall into the rushing water. Her grateful mother embraced her daughter tightly. "Thank you, Ethan." He simply tipped his hat. "No thanks needed." Margaret stood frozen, embarrassed that she had been thinking only of herself while Ethan had been thinking of others. Still, frustration burned inside her. She turned sharply and walked away. Whispers immediately spread through the crowd. He refused Margaret Collins again. What woman could ever win his heart? Does he even have one to give? Not far from the church steps, a young schoolteacher quietly observed everything. Her name was Abigail Harper. Unlike the others, she hadn't come to watch Ethan. She had been helping several of her students organize books for the church library. Only after hearing the murmurs did she glance toward the cowboy everyone admired. She noticed something the others seemed to miss. Whenever people laughed about marriage, whenever someone mentioned husbands, wives, or children, a shadow crossed Ethan's face. It lasted only a heartbeat. Almost no one saw it, but Abigail did. His smile never reached his eyes. There was kindness in them, gentleness, strength, but beneath it all, a sorrow so deep it seemed older than the mountains themselves. Abigail didn't wonder why every woman wanted Ethan Walker. That answer was obvious. Instead, she found herself asking a different question. What happened to him? She had no desire to chase the most admired cowboy in Wyoming, but for the first time, she saw beyond the legend, beyond the quiet smile, beyond the hard-working hands. She saw a lonely man carrying a burden no one else seemed willing or able to see. And though neither of them knew it yet, that single observation would become the first step in a journey that would change not only their lives, but the heart of the entire valley. The harvest celebration became the talk of Willow Creek for weeks. Not because of the music, not because of the pies that disappeared before noon, not even because Margaret Collins had once again failed to convince Ethan Walker to dance. People talked because Ethan had done exactly what everyone expected. He had helped. He had smiled. He had spoken kindly to everyone. Then he had gone home alone. The mystery of the valley remained unsolved. Monday morning arrived with dark clouds stretching across the Wyoming sky. A gentle rain fell over the valley, tapping softly against rooftops and turning the dusty roads into ribbons of mud. Most ranchers welcomed the rain. The grass needed it. The cattle needed it. The land itself seemed to sigh with relief. Ethan, however, wasn't thinking about the weather. He was repairing a section of broken fence near the Thompson Ranch when Mr. Thompson rode up. "Ethan!" The older rancher waved from horseback. "I've got another job if you've finished here." Ethan hammered one last nail into the fence post before standing. "What needs fixing?" "The schoolyard fence." Ethan smiled. "I'll head there now. You'll probably find Miss Harper teaching inside. I'll stay out of her way." Mr. Thompson laughed. "I doubt she'd notice you're there." The little schoolhouse stood at the edge of town beneath two enormous cottonwood trees. Children's laughter floated through the open windows despite the rain outside. Ethan tied Ranger beneath one of the trees before gathering his tools. As he approached the fence, he paused. Inside, Abigail Harper stood before nearly 20 children. She wasn't reading from a book. She was telling a story. "And what happened after David trusted God?" she asked. A little boy raised his hand eagerly. "He wasn't afraid anymore." Abigail smiled warmly. "Exactly. Being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you choose to trust God, even while you're afraid." The children nodded thoughtfully. Ethan found himself standing still. He had intended to begin working immediately. Instead, he listened. Her voice was calm, gentle, patient. Every child watched her with complete attention. There was something different about her. She taught with joy, not merely information, hope. After a few moments, Ethan quietly walked toward the damaged fence and began replacing the broken rails. He worked carefully so the hammer wouldn't interrupt the lesson. When school ended, children burst through the front door like birds escaping a cage. Several ran toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, can we help?" He laughed. "Only if you don't mind getting muddy." Within seconds, 5 boys and 3 girls eagerly carried boards, gathered nails, and held fence posts steady. Abigail stepped outside, carrying a stack of books. She smiled at the unexpected sight. "You've hired quite a crew." Ethan chuckled. "I don't think they'd appreciate being called workers." One little girl grinned. "We're assistants." "Important assistants," Ethan corrected. The children beamed with pride. Abigail noticed something remarkable. He spoke to children exactly as he spoke to adults, with respect, with kindness. Never pretending, never talking down to them. Perhaps that was why they loved him so much. An hour later, the fence stood stronger than before. The last child hurried home. Rain continued falling softly. Only Ethan and Abigail remained. She walked toward the newly repaired gate, running her hand across the smooth wood. This should last for years. It ought to. You've done beautiful work. He shrugged. It only needed a little attention. She looked at the sturdy fence. People are a lot like fences. Ethan looked up. How so? We ignore little breaks until they become big ones. He thought about that for a moment. That's probably true. Neither spoke for several seconds. Rain dripped steadily from the roof. Somewhere nearby, a meadowlark sang despite the weather. Finally, Abigail broke the silence. Thank you for helping the school. The children deserve a safe place. She smiled. They're fortunate to have someone who thinks that way. He simply nodded. Praise always made him uncomfortable. Over the next several weeks, their paths crossed more often. Sometimes Ethan repaired loose steps outside the school. Other times, he delivered firewood before winter mornings grew colder. Occasionally, he helped parents whose wagons became stuck in mud near the schoolhouse. Every time Abigail thanked him, every time Ethan answered with the same simple words, happy to help, nothing more. Unlike nearly every woman in Willow Creek, Abigail never lingered, never searched for reasons to continue the conversation, never asked personal questions. She accepted his kindness without trying to turn it into romance. That puzzled Ethan more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, he stopped at Harper's general store after finishing work. Mrs. Harper greeted him warmly. Good afternoon, Ethan. Afternoon. She handed him the sack of flour he had ordered. My daughter says you fixed the school fence. It wasn't much. Mrs. Harper smiled knowingly. That's what you always say. Ethan looked around the store. Is Miss Harper here? The question surprised even him. Mrs. Harper pointed toward the back room. She's organizing books. He thanked her and carried 2 heavy boxes toward the storeroom before Abigail even noticed him. Oh, she looked up from a pile of worn books. I didn't hear you come in. Your mother asked me to carry these. You didn't have to. I was already walking this way. She laughed softly. I somehow doubt that. He smiled. Perhaps. As they arranged books on wooden shelves, silence settled between them. Unlike awkward silence, this one felt peaceful, comfortable. Abigail finally spoke. Do you enjoy quiet? I suppose I do. So do I. Most people don't. They're afraid of it. She carefully dusted another book. I think quiet helps us hear things we usually miss. What kinds of things? Our thoughts. She smiled. And sometimes God's voice. Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. Few people spoke so naturally about faith. Not as a performance, simply as part of life. Days turned into weeks. Autumn painted the valley with brilliant shades of gold, crimson, and amber. Morning frost sparkled across the fields. The mountains wore fresh snow along their highest peaks. Willow Creek prepared for another long Wyoming winter. Yet something unusual had begun happening. People noticed Ethan lingering near the school more often. Not because Abigail invited him, because he found reasons to help. Repairing shutters, stacking firewood, sharpening tools, replacing loose hinges. Old Ben watched from across the street one afternoon. A younger cowboy grinned. Looks like Ethan's finally courting someone. Old Ben slowly shook his head. No. What do you mean? If he were courting her, he'd be talking. Instead, Ethan worked. Abigail read. Sometimes they shared coffee. Sometimes they barely exchanged 10 words. Yet both seemed strangely content. One chilly afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying fresh-cut firewood. Abigail stepped outside. You'll spoil us. I don't think enough firewood has ever spoiled anyone. She laughed. I suppose not. He stacked the wood beneath the porch roof before brushing snow from his sleeves. She offered him a cup of hot coffee. This much I insist on. He accepted. For several minutes they sat quietly beneath the porch while snowflakes drifted gently across the valley. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been quietly growing inside him for weeks. "You don't seem interested in knowing me." Abigail looked at him, surprised. "What makes you say that? Most people ask questions. You don't." She considered her answer carefully. "I don't know you. You could." "I suppose I could." He waited. She smiled kindly. "But I don't chase people." Those simple words caught him completely off guard. Every woman in Willow Creek had tried to gain his attention. Some baked pies. Others found excuses to visit the ranch. Margaret Collins practically organized half the town's social events around the hope Ethan might attend. Yet Abigail did none of it. She simply lived her life, teaching children, helping neighbors, serving at church, trusting God with whatever came next. For reasons Ethan couldn't explain, he admired that more than beauty. Trying to hide his curiosity, Ethan asked another question. "Don't you ever wonder why I've never married?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before answering. "No." His eyebrows lifted. "No?" She shook her head gently. "If you wanted me to know, you'd tell me. If you don't, then it's not my place to ask." The words settled deep inside him. For years people had chased his secret. Some guessed, others invented stories. Many assumed the worst, but Abigail respected the silence. Not because she lacked curiosity, because she valued the person more than the mystery. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Ethan felt understood without having explained a single thing. That evening he rode home beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. The cold wind swept across the open prairie, but his thoughts remained fixed on the conversation outside the schoolhouse. She didn't admire him because other people did. She didn't flatter him. She didn't try to impress him. She treated him as though he were simply another child of God. Nothing more, nothing less. As Ranger walked steadily along the familiar trail, Ethan whispered almost to himself, "Who are you, Abigail Harper?" Back in town, Abigail extinguished the last lantern inside the schoolhouse before kneeling beside her desk. She folded her hands and bowed her head. "Father," she prayed softly, "thank you for today. Help me see people the way you see them. Teach me never to judge by appearances, but to love others with wisdom, kindness, and truth. And if Ethan Walker is carrying a burden too heavy for one man, give him the courage to place it into your hands when the time is right. Amen." She rose, unaware that her simple prayer would soon become the beginning of a miracle neither of them could yet imagine. The quiet friendship between the lonely cowboy and the fearless schoolteacher had begun, not with romance, but with respect, and sometimes God builds the strongest love stories on that very foundation. Winter arrived early that year. By the first week of November, the mountains surrounding Willow Creek were covered in thick blankets of snow. The crisp autumn breeze had given way to a biting wind that whistled through the pine trees and across the open prairie. Smoke curled from the chimneys of every cabin in town. The ranchers hurried to stack firewood. Mothers mended coats beside warm fireplaces. Children laughed as they chased one another through the first snowfall, their cheerful voices echoing through the quiet valley. Life slowed with the coming of winter. But gossip never did. Inside Harper's general store, several women warmed themselves beside the iron stove while waiting for the snowstorm outside to ease. As usual, the conversation found its way to Ethan Walker. "I heard he repaired the Miller family's barn all by himself. He also delivered firewood to the widow Jenkins. My cousin says he spent 2 days helping the Andersons bring in their cattle." One woman sighed dreamily. "I still don't understand why no woman can win his heart." Another smiled knowingly. "Perhaps someone already has." Several heads turned. "You mean Miss Harper?" The woman nodded. "They've been speaking quite often." Across the room, Margaret Collins quietly listened. Her expression tightened. She had noticed it too. Not because Ethan spent long hours with Abigail. He didn't. Not because they courted openly. They didn't. What troubled Margaret was something much simpler. Whenever Ethan spoke with Abigail, he smiled differently. It wasn't the polite smile he gave everyone else. It was smaller, more genuine, as though, for just a moment, he forgot to carry whatever invisible burden weighed upon him. Margaret couldn't stand it. Later that afternoon, she rode to her father's ranch in silence. Her father, Henry Collins, noticed immediately. "You've hardly touched your supper." "I'm not hungry." "You've been thinking about Ethan again." Margaret sighed heavily. "I don't understand him." Henry leaned back in his chair. "Most men would be honored to marry you." "I don't want most men." "You want the one you cannot have." She lowered her eyes. "Why won't he choose anyone?" Henry stared thoughtfully into the fire. "Sometimes people carry wounds they never speak about. But surely love could heal them. Only if they're willing to be healed." Margaret looked unconvinced. She still believed persistence would eventually change Ethan's mind. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the evening repairing harnesses inside the Thompson Ranch barn. Old Ben entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "I figured you could use this." Ethan smiled gratefully. "Thank you." The old foreman sat beside him on a hay bale. For several minutes they worked in silence. Old Ben finally spoke. "You've been smiling more lately." Ethan chuckled softly. "Have I?" "You have. I hadn't noticed." "I have." Ethan continued stitching the worn leather. Old Ben watched him carefully. "Miss Harper has something to do with it." Ethan didn't answer. The silence itself became an answer. Ben smiled. "She's a good woman." "She is." And what?" "Are you planning to tell her?" Ethan's hands stopped moving. His smile disappeared. The warmth in his eyes faded. Just like that. Old Ben immediately regretted asking. "I'm sorry." "It's all right?" "No." Ben shook his head. "I promised never to pressure you." Ethan stared at the barn floor. "I don't even know where to begin." That night, the wind howled across the valley. Sleep refused to come. Ethan lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling of his small cabin. The memories always came on nights like this. Cold nights, stormy nights, lonely nights. He closed his eyes. Suddenly, he was 12 years old again. The wagon creaked slowly along a narrow mountain trail. His father held the reins. His mother hummed an old hymn while sewing a torn blanket. His little sister Lily laughed as she tried catching snowflakes in her tiny hands. Ethan remembered every detail. The smell of pine trees, the sound of horses, the warmth of his mother's smile. He had believed life would always remain that way. Then, gunshots shattered the mountain silence. The horses panicked. His father shouted. Bandits emerged from behind enormous rocks. Chaos exploded around them. His father climbed down with his hands raised. "We don't want trouble." Another gunshot answered him. His mother screamed. His little sister cried for Ethan. He remembered trying to reach her. He remembered falling into deep brush beside the trail. He remembered watching, unable to move, unable to help, as everything he loved disappeared forever. When the sheriff finally found him the next morning, he was the only survivor. Ethan sat upright in bed. His breathing came hard. Sweat covered his face despite the freezing air. 26 years had passed, yet the nightmare remained exactly the same. He whispered into the darkness. "Why them, Lord?" The cabin remained silent. He bowed his head. "I should have died with them." The words echoed through the lonely room. Words he had repeated hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. Words he believed, even though God never spoke them. The following Sunday, Willow Creek gathered for church despite the heavy snow. Inside, the little building glowed with warmth. Children removed wet boots near the entrance. Families squeezed together beneath thick wool blankets. Pastor Samuel stepped to the pulpit. His message came from Psalm 34. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." His voice filled the room. Many people believe brokenness is something to hide. It isn't. The Lord draws nearest to those who finally admit they cannot carry life's burdens alone. Ethan lowered his head. Every word pierced his heart. Abigail noticed. Not because he looked weak, because his shoulders seemed heavier than usual, as though invisible chains rested upon them. After church, families gathered outside despite the cold. Children built snowmen. Women exchanged recipes. Men discussed cattle prices and winter preparations. Margaret walked directly toward Abigail. Several people noticed. The cheerful conversations around them slowly quieted. Margaret forced a pleasant smile. "Miss Harper, good afternoon. I hear you've become quite friendly with Ethan." Abigail answered calmly. "We've spoken a few times." "A few times?" Margaret folded her arms. "The entire town believes you're trying to steal him." Abigail looked genuinely surprised. "You cannot steal a person." Margaret's voice sharpened. "Don't pretend you don't know what people are saying." "I know what they are saying. And I don't live my life by gossip." Several women quietly exchanged nervous glances. Margaret stepped closer. "Do you love him?" Abigail paused, then answered honestly, "I barely know him." "Then leave him alone." Abigail's expression remained peaceful. "I've never chased him. He keeps finding reasons to be near you." "Then perhaps you should ask him why." Margaret had no answer. She turned and walked away, embarrassed by the calm dignity with which Abigail had spoken. That evening, the church hosted a simple supper for families whose food supplies had grown low because of the early winter. Everyone helped. Men carried tables. Women served stew. Children filled baskets with bread. Ethan quietly repaired a loose leg beneath one of the tables, while Abigail organized blankets for several elderly widows. Neither sought the other's attention, yet somehow their paths naturally crossed. As Abigail carried another basket, she noticed Ethan standing alone outside beneath the stars. Snowflakes drifted gently around him. He stared toward the mountains, lost in thought. She stepped beside him. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt comfortable. Finally, Abigail asked, "Beautiful night." "It is. You seem far away." "I suppose I am." She didn't press further. Instead, she simply stood beside him. Several peaceful moments passed. The wind whispered through the trees. Lantern light flickered behind them. Then Ethan quietly asked, "Have you ever lost someone?" She looked toward the snowy hills. "My father. When I was 16. I'm sorry." "So am I." She smiled sadly. "For a long time I believed losing him meant I'd never feel whole again. What changed? I realized grief doesn't disappear. It changes. It teaches. And if we allow God, it softens." Ethan listened carefully. Every word felt strangely familiar. The following week, Willow Creek held its annual Christmas charity gathering in the church hall. Nearly everyone attended. The room overflowed with laughter, music, and warm conversation. Pastor Samuel invited families to share testimonies of God's faithfulness during the year. One by one, people stood. A rancher thanked God for rain. A widow thanked God for generous neighbors. A young couple thanked God for the birth of their first child. Then Pastor Samuel looked toward Ethan. "Brother Walker." The room grew quiet. "You've blessed this community more than most of us realize. Would you share a word?" Every face turned toward him. Ethan slowly stood. His hands trembled slightly. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. After several uncomfortable moments, he quietly sat back down. "I'm sorry. I can't." No one mocked him, but confusion spread through the room. Why couldn't the strongest man in Willow Creek speak? Abigail knew. Not the details, but the reason. His silence wasn't pride. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't indifference. It was pain. Pain buried so deeply that even gratitude struggled to find its way through. Without planning to, Abigail rose to her feet. The room looked at her with surprise. She wasn't trying to embarrass Ethan. She wasn't trying to expose him. She simply couldn't bear watching people misunderstand him any longer. She spoke gently, her voice calm enough that every person leaned forward to hear. Everyone here keeps asking the wrong question. The room became completely silent. She looked around at the familiar faces. For months I've heard people ask why Ethan Walker refuses to marry, why he keeps to himself, why he always walks away. She turned toward Ethan, her eyes filled not with accusation, but compassion. No one has stopped to ask whether he's still hurting. The words settled over the room like fresh snow. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes. She continued softly, "I don't believe you fear marriage." A tear formed in the corner of Ethan's eye. "I believe." She paused for just a moment. "You fear losing another family." The hall fell into stunned silence. Old Ben Carter closed his eyes. Pastor Samuel bowed his head. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that single sentence, a truth hidden for more than 20 years had finally been spoken aloud. Not to shame a lonely cowboy, but to begin setting him free. The church hall remained silent. No one reached for another bowl of stew. No child whispered. Even the crackling fire in the stone hearth seemed louder than the people gathered inside. Every eye rested on Ethan Walker, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a quiet realization. For years they had admired the cowboy. For years they had wondered why he refused every woman who tried to win his heart. They had built stories around his silence. Some believed he was proud. Others thought he secretly loved someone who had died. A few even whispered that he simply enjoyed watching women compete for his attention. None of those stories had been true. The truth was far heavier and far sadder. Ethan wasn't protecting his heart. He was trying to protect everyone else's. Abigail immediately questioned whether she had said too much. She had never intended to reveal his private struggle before the entire church. She had only wanted people to stop treating him like a mystery that needed solving. Instead, she wanted them to see him as a wounded man who needed compassion. She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn." Before anyone else could respond, Ethan slowly stood. His boots echoed softly against the wooden floor as he stepped forward. Every movement seemed heavier than the last. When he finally reached the front of the room, he turned toward the congregation. His voice trembled. "Miss Harper." He paused, then looked directly at her. "You have nothing to apologize for." A tear slipped down his weathered face. "You only spoke what I have been too afraid to admit." No one moved. Even the children sensed something sacred was happening. Ethan took a slow breath. "I've spent more than half my life hiding." He looked toward Pastor Samuel. Then old Ben. Then the people who had become his neighbors. "I thought silence was easier." His hands trembled. But silence can become its own prison. He swallowed hard. "When I was 12 years old," his voice nearly failed him, "I watched my family die." Several women quietly covered their mouths. One elderly rancher removed his hat. "I survived. They didn't." He closed his eyes. "And ever since that day, I believed everyone who came close to me would eventually suffer because of me." His words hung heavily in the air. "I convinced myself that staying alone was the safest thing I could do. I told myself loneliness was a sacrifice. But it wasn't." He looked down. It was fear. No one spoke. Not because they didn't care, because there were no words big enough. Old Ben slowly walked to Ethan's side. The elderly foreman placed a rough hand on the younger man's shoulder. "I've carried this secret with you for 26 years. His own voice cracked. "And I've often wondered whether keeping my promise helped you, or hurt you." Ethan looked at him with affection. "You kept your word, but perhaps I hid behind it." Old Ben nodded sadly. "I think we both did." The two men embraced. Many in the congregation quietly wiped away tears. Pastor Samuel stepped forward, carrying his well-worn Bible. He did not rush. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he rested one hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. "My son, there is a difference between remembering pain and allowing pain to become your master." He opened the scriptures. The prophet Isaiah wrote these words hundreds of years before Christ came. He began reading, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." The pastor closed the Bible. God knows exactly what happened on that mountain. He has never forgotten. But neither has he abandoned you there. Ethan listened quietly. "I've prayed. I've worked. I've tried to live honorably." Pastor Samuel smiled kindly. "I know, but you've done something else." "What?" "You've mistaken guilt for responsibility." The words landed with startling force. "I don't understand." "You were a child. You were never responsible for the evil choices made by those bandits. But I lived. So did David. So did Joseph. So did Moses. So did Paul. The fact that God preserved your life was not punishment. It was purpose." Those words followed Ethan long after everyone returned home. The wind had settled. Fresh snow reflected the moonlight across the valley. Instead of riding straight to his cabin, Ethan guided Ranger toward the old cemetery outside town. Rows of simple wooden crosses stood quietly beneath the snow. He stopped before 3 graves: his parents, his little sister. He removed his hat. For several minutes he simply stood there. Finally he spoke aloud. "I'm tired." His voice cracked. So very tired. He knelt in the snow. "I've spent 26 years trying to protect people from something that wasn't mine to carry." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to let go." The cold wind brushed across the hillside. No voice answered him. No miracle appeared. Only silence. Yet somehow, the silence felt different. Not empty. Peaceful. As though God was gently waiting. Not demanding. Simply inviting. The next morning, Ethan did something he had avoided for years. He knocked on the door of the small church. Pastor Samuel opened it with a warm smile. "I wondered when you'd come." "You knew. I've been praying for this day for a long time." They entered the sanctuary together. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting colors across the worn wooden pews. Neither man hurried. Pastor Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee before they sat near the front. "I don't know where to begin." "Begin where it hurts." Ethan stared at the empty cross hanging above the pulpit. "I still hear my sister calling my name." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I still wonder whether I could have saved them." Pastor Samuel listened without interruption. For nearly 2 hours, Ethan spoke. About the wagon, the gunfire, the fear, the nightmares, the loneliness, the birthdays spent alone, the Christmas mornings he never celebrated, the countless women he had quietly turned away. Not because they lacked goodness, because he believed loving them would place them in danger. When he finally finished, the room was quiet. Pastor Samuel gently asked, "Ethan, do you believe God punishes innocent people because someone loves them?" "No." "Do you believe God commands his children to live in fear?" "No." "Then why have you spent 26 years obeying fear instead of God?" The question pierced him. He had no answer. They knelt together at the altar, not for a quick prayer, not for a ceremony, for surrender. Ethan bowed his head. The words came slowly at first, then freely. "Father, I've trusted you with my work. I've trusted you with my reputation. I've trusted you with my future, but I've never trusted you with my pain." His shoulders shook. "I've carried guilt you never asked me to carry. I've hidden behind loneliness because I believed it honored my family. It didn't. It only kept me from living." His tears fell onto the wooden floor. "Please forgive me. Teach me how to live again." Pastor Samuel quietly prayed beside him, not asking God to erase the past, but asking him to redeem it. When they finally stood, Ethan looked different. Not because every wound had healed. Some scars remain for a lifetime, but because he had stopped hiding them from God. Meanwhile, news of the previous evening spread quickly through Willow Creek. Some people misunderstood Abigail's words. Others criticized her. Inside the general store, Two women whispered as she arranged books for the church library. "I can't believe she exposed Ethan like that. She embarrassed him." A third woman added, "Now everyone knows his private business." Abigail quietly continued working. Mrs. Harper finally stepped beside her daughter. "Does it bother you?" Abigail smiled gently. "A little." "Then why aren't you defending yourself?" She placed another book on the shelf. "Because I didn't speak to defend myself. I spoke because someone needed defending." Mrs. Harper looked at her daughter with quiet pride. "You've always been your father's child." Abigail laughed softly. "He used to say truth should never be spoken like a hammer." Mrs. Harper nodded. "But like a lantern, so people can finally see." That afternoon, Margaret Collins rode into town. She found Abigail helping several children gather wood behind the schoolhouse. After the children left, Margaret approached. For the first time, there was no anger in her voice. "I owe you an apology." Abigail looked surprised. "You do? I judged you. I thought you wanted Ethan for yourself." Abigail smiled. "I never did." Margaret looked toward the snowy hills. "I spent years trying to make him notice me. You spent one evening helping him breathe again." Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes. "I never saw his pain. You saw the man everyone admired," Abigail answered gently. "I simply happened to notice the man everyone overlooked." Margaret nodded slowly. "I hope he finds peace. So do I." Several weeks passed. Winter deepened. The river froze along its edges. Snow covered every rooftop in Willow Creek. Something, however, had begun to change. People no longer whispered about Ethan. They greeted him differently, with understanding, with gentleness. No one pressured him to explain himself. No one joked about his bachelorhood. Children still ran toward him. Neighbors still asked for his help. But now, when they thanked him, they also asked, "How are you doing today?" It was a simple question, yet perhaps no one had ever truly asked him before. One bright winter afternoon, Ethan arrived at the school carrying freshly split firewood. Abigail stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tightly against the cold. "You've brought enough wood for a month. The forecast says another storm is coming." She smiled. "You think of everything." He looked at her quietly. "No, I didn't." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "For years. I forgot to think about my own heart." He hesitated. "I wanted to thank you." "You don't owe me thanks." "I do. You told me the truth." He looked across the snow-covered valley. "It hurt." She nodded. "Truth often does." But afterward, he smiled. A real smile, unburdened and warm. I could finally breathe. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The only sound was the gentle crunch of snow beneath their boots. Finally, Abigail said, "Healing isn't a single moment. It's a journey." "I know," Ethan replied. "For the first time in many years, I think I'm finally ready to take the next step." As they stood beneath the pale winter sky, neither realized that spring would bring more than new grass and blooming wildflowers. It would bring hope. It would bring courage. And, in God's perfect timing, it would bring a love that neither fear nor sorrow could ever steal. Winter lingered longer than anyone expected. Heavy snow continued to blanket the valley well into March, covering the hills in brilliant white. The roads remained difficult to travel, and the nights were still bitterly cold. Yet beneath the frozen ground, spring was quietly preparing to awaken. The people of Willow Creek often said that God worked much like the changing seasons. Sometimes you couldn't see him working, but that didn't mean he wasn't. The same was becoming true in Ethan Walker's life. No one could point to one dramatic moment that changed him overnight. Healing came slowly, like snow melting beneath the first warm rays of spring. One day at a time, one prayer at a time, one faithful step at a time. Every morning before beginning his ranch work, Ethan stopped inside the little church. Not because anyone expected him to, because he wanted to. The sanctuary was always quiet before sunrise. The stained glass windows reflected soft colors across the empty pews. Dust floated lazily through beams of golden light. Ethan would remove his hat, kneel at the wooden altar, and pray. At first, the prayers were awkward. For years he had prayed only for strength to keep going. Now his prayers were different. Father, teach me how to live without fear. Teach me how to trust you more than I trust my own pain. Help me become the man you created me to be. He no longer prayed like a man trying to survive. He prayed like a man learning to live. Pastor Samuel never interrupted those quiet mornings. Sometimes he simply sat in the last pew, silently thanking God for answering prayers he had prayed for nearly 20 years. The changes soon became noticeable throughout the valley. Old Ben was the first to mention it. The two men were repairing a windmill one bright afternoon when Ben leaned against the weathered wooden frame and smiled. "You laughed today." Ethan looked confused. "I did?" "You did. When?" "When Tommy accidentally chased the chickens into the horse barn." Ethan chuckled as he remembered the little ranch hand running after the frightened birds. "I suppose I did laugh." Old Ben grinned. "It's a good sound." Ethan climbed down from the ladder. "I didn't realize I'd stopped." Ben's smile faded gently. When a man carries sorrow long enough, he forgets what joy sounds like. Ethan stood quietly. "I think I'm beginning to remember." The Thompson Ranch welcomed several orphaned brothers whose uncle had fallen ill. The three boys, Daniel, Luke, and Matthew, were sent to work temporarily until their uncle recovered. They were polite children, but years of hardship had stolen much of their confidence. The youngest, 8-year-old Matthew, barely spoke at all. The first morning they arrived, Ethan found the boys standing awkwardly outside the barn. "You boys know horses?" Daniel shrugged. "A little." Matthew stared at the ground. Ethan smiled warmly. "Then today you'll learn a little more." He introduced them to every horse by name. "This is Ranger. He likes apples. This one's Daisy. Don't stand behind her. And this stubborn fellow is Duke." Duke immediately nudged Ethan hard enough to nearly knock off his hat. The boys burst into laughter. Even little Matthew smiled. Old Ben watched from across the yard. He whispered to Mr. Thompson, "Look at him." The ranch owner smiled. "What about him?" "He finally stopped hiding from children." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "I don't think he was hiding from them." "No," Ben answered softly. "He was hiding from becoming attached." Weeks passed. The boys quickly grew fond of Ethan. Every afternoon they gathered around him after chores. "Tell us another trail story. What was Texas like? Have you ever fought wolves? Did you really cross the mountains in winter?" Ethan answered every question patiently, sometimes with humor, sometimes with wisdom. One evening, little Matthew quietly asked, "Mr. Walker?" "Yes?" "Were you ever scared?" The older boys looked embarrassed. Matthew lowered his head. "You don't have to answer." But Ethan did. "Yes." "When?" "A great many times." Matthew looked surprised. "But everyone says you're brave." Ethan rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Being brave doesn't mean you never feel afraid. It means you keep doing what's right, even while you're afraid." Matthew smiled. "Miss Harper says that too." Ethan laughed softly. "She's a very wise woman." Meanwhile, Abigail continued teaching at the little schoolhouse. Spring sunshine now poured through the windows, replacing the gray skies of winter. Her students noticed she smiled more often these days, not because life had become easier, because hope had returned to the valley. One afternoon, her class discussed the story of Joseph. A young girl raised her hand. Why did Joseph forgive his brothers? Abigail thought for a moment before answering. Because forgiveness doesn't change yesterday. It changes tomorrow. The children quietly considered her words. Outside the classroom window, Ethan was repairing the schoolhouse porch. He paused. Those simple words reached him through the open window. Forgiveness doesn't change yesterday. It changes tomorrow. He whispered them to himself several times while driving another nail into the porch railing. For years he had wished he could change the past. Perhaps God was inviting him to build a different future instead. That evening, Ethan visited the cemetery again. Unlike previous visits, he wasn't carrying guilt, only flowers. Fresh wildflowers he had gathered from the first blooms of spring. He knelt before the 3 familiar graves. "Hello, Mama. Hello, Papa. Hello, Lily." A gentle breeze stirred the grass. "I came to tell you something." He smiled through tears. "I'm going to stop blaming myself. I know now that none of it was my fault." His voice grew stronger. "I'll always miss you. I'll always love you. But I think," he looked toward heaven, "I think God still has work for me here." For the first time in 26 years, he stood up without feeling crushed by the weight of the past. He walked away carrying grief, but no longer carrying guilt. Spring transformed Willow Creek. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. The streams flowed freely once more. Birdsong returned to the valley. Families gathered outdoors after church, enjoying the warmth that had been absent for months. At the annual Spring Fellowship picnic, laughter echoed across the meadow. Children played tag between the trees. Women prepared baskets filled with roasted chicken, fresh bread, and berry pies. The fiddler tuned his instrument beneath the old cottonwood tree. As always, Ethan arrived early. But this time, something was different. Instead of standing quietly on the edge of the crowd, he joined several ranchers in setting up tables. He laughed with old Ben. He helped children organize games. When Pastor Samuel asked for volunteers to lead a hymn, Ethan's hand slowly rose. The congregation looked pleasantly surprised. His rich baritone voice blended with the others as they sang, "Great is thy faithfulness." Abigail stood among the women listening. A smile slowly spread across her face. She had never heard him sing before. His voice wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. Pastor Samuel noticed her watching. He quietly smiled to himself. God truly was making all things new. Later that afternoon, Abigail wandered toward a hillside overlooking the valley. She carried a small sketchbook where she often drew wildflowers and mountain landscapes. She sat beneath a large oak tree, carefully sketching the distant ranches. A familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "May I join you?" She looked up. Ethan stood a few feet away, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "I brought enough for both of us." She smiled warmly. "I'd like that." He sat beside her, leaving respectful space between them. For several minutes neither spoke. The silence felt peaceful, rather than awkward. Finally, Ethan glanced toward her drawing. "I didn't know you could sketch." "I'm still learning." "It looks beautiful." "It's only the beginning." She smiled. "So is spring." He nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose healing is like that." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He picked up a small pebble and rolled it thoughtfully between his fingers. "When winter ends, the trees don't bloom overnight. They change little by little." She smiled. "That's true. I spent years wishing God would simply erase my pain." He looked across the valley where cattle grazed peacefully. "But instead, he stayed with me while I healed." Abigail's eyes softened. "That's often how he works." Ethan took a slow breath. "There was a time I believed loneliness honored my family." She listened quietly. "I thought if I never loved anyone, I could never lose them." He shook his head gently. "I've realized something." "What is it?" "I wasn't protecting anyone. I was allowing fear to write the rest of my life." Abigail closed her sketchbook. "And fear is a poor author." He laughed. "It certainly is." She continued, "Faith doesn't promise we'll never lose people. No, it promises we'll never face loss alone." Those words settled deeply into Ethan's heart. He looked toward the wide Wyoming sky. Clouds drifted lazily across endless blue. For the first time in many years, the future didn't frighten him. It invited him. As the afternoon turned to evening, music once again filled the meadow. Young couples gathered beneath strings of lanterns hung from the trees. Children begged their parents for one last game before heading home. Margaret Collins approached Ethan with a warm smile. There was no jealousy in her eyes now. Only friendship. I owe you something. He looked surprised. What would that be? A thank you. For what? For reminding me that people aren't prizes to be won. She laughed softly. I spent years trying to make you notice me. I never once stopped to ask what you needed. Ethan smiled kindly. We've both learned a great deal. She extended her hand. Friends? He shook it warmly. Friends. From a distance, Abigail witnessed the exchange. She smiled. Healing had touched more than one heart. As the lanterns flickered beneath the evening sky, Pastor Samuel stood beside old Ben, watching Ethan help little Matthew learn a simple line dance. The boy stumbled over his boots. Ethan laughed and steadied him. Old Ben folded his arms. Do you see it? Pastor Samuel nodded. I do. The chains are gone. Not all of them. Ben replied thoughtfully. No, but the locks have been broken. The pastor smiled. And once Christ opens a prison door, he rarely leaves anyone standing inside. Across the meadow, Ethan glanced toward Abigail. Their eyes met. Neither hurried toward the other. Neither spoke a word. Yet in that quiet glance was something new. Not uncertainty, not fear. Hope, the kind of hope that grows only after deep sorrow, has surrendered itself to God's faithful hands. Neither of them knew what the coming weeks would bring. But both sensed that the next chapter of their lives was beginning. Not because fear had disappeared completely, but because faith had become stronger than fear. Summer arrived in Willow Creek, with fields of wildflowers stretching toward the distant mountains. The river sparkled beneath the warm Wyoming sun, and the air carried the comforting sounds of grazing cattle, singing meadowlarks, and children's laughter. The valley looked different, not because the buildings had changed, not because the ranches had grown larger. The people had changed. They smiled more. Neighbors visited one another more often. Families gathered for evening meals without rushing away afterward. Something beautiful had spread through the community. Compassion. People had learned that every smiling face could be hiding a heavy burden, and because of one fearless woman's honesty, they had begun looking beyond appearances. Ethan Walker was changing too. Every morning still began with prayer. Every evening still ended with gratitude. But now there was joy woven into the quiet rhythm of his days. He laughed freely with the ranch hands. He played games with the children after church. He even teased old Ben whenever the elderly foreman insisted he could still outride men half his age. One bright morning, old Ben attempted to mount a spirited young horse. The horse took 3 quick steps before Ben lost his balance and landed harmlessly in a pile of hay. The younger cowboys burst into laughter. Ben looked around with mock seriousness. I meant to do that. Ethan laughed so hard that tears filled his eyes. Ben pointed toward him. There it is again. What? That laugh. I've waited years to hear it. Ethan helped the old man to his feet. I'm glad you finally did. One afternoon, Pastor Samuel visited the Thompson Ranch. He found Ethan repairing a broken wagon wheel beneath a shade tree. I hope I'm not interrupting. Never. The pastor sat beside him. I've been watching you. Ethan smiled. I hope that's a good thing. It is. He folded his hands. Do you remember our conversation in the church? I remember every word. You told me you wanted to learn how to live again. I did. And now? Ethan looked across the pasture where the 3 orphaned brothers were laughing as they chased calves toward the barn. I think, he paused, I'm finally living. Pastor Samuel smiled warmly. Then there is one more question. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What question? What are you going to do with the life God has restored? The pastor stood before Ethan could answer. I'll let you pray about that. Then he quietly rode away. That evening, Ethan sat alone beside the creek. The water flowed gently over smooth stones, reflecting the golden colors of the setting sun. Pastor Samuel's question lingered in his heart. What are you going to do with the life God has restored? For years, his answer would have been simple. Work harder. help more people, stay alone. But now, the answer no longer seemed complete. He realized something that both frightened and excited him. God had not simply healed him from the past. He was inviting him into a future that might include love. The thought no longer filled him with terror. It filled him with quiet anticipation. The next Saturday, Willow Creek gathered for its annual summer harvest dance. Colorful lanterns hung from the giant cottonwood trees surrounding the churchyard. Long tables overflowed with homemade bread, roasted beef, fresh vegetables, apple pies, peach cobblers, and jars of sweet lemonade. Children raced through the grass carrying ribbons and wildflowers. Musicians tuned fiddles, guitars, and harmonicas beneath the open sky. The celebration had become one of the valley's favorite traditions. But this year, everyone sensed something special was about to happen. Old Ben certainly believed so. As he adjusted his suspenders, he leaned toward Pastor Samuel. "You reckon he'll finally ask her?" The pastor smiled. "I believe God has been preparing him for months. I just hope Ethan doesn't lose his nerve." Meanwhile, Abigail helped several young girls decorate the church porch with fresh flowers. She wore a simple cream-colored dress with light blue embroidery around the sleeves. Her brown hair was gently braided, with tiny wildflowers tucked into one side. She had never tried to outshine anyone, yet her quiet grace seemed brighter than the summer sunlight. Mrs. Harper walked beside her daughter. "You seem happy."
"I am."
"Because of Ethan?" Abigail smiled gently. "Partly. And the other part?" "Because I've watched God answer prayers." Mrs. Harper squeezed her daughter's hand. "I've noticed. As evening settled over the valley, music filled the air. Families gathered beneath glowing lanterns. Couples began dancing. Children clapped along with the lively tunes. Margaret Collins noticed Ethan standing near the edge of the celebration. She smiled knowingly. "Aren't you going to stand there all night?" He laughed. "I might." She folded her arms. "No, not tonight." Before Ethan could respond, Margaret gently nudged him toward the dance floor. "I chased you for years. I'm finished doing the walking. It's your turn." He smiled. "I suppose it is." Across the meadow, Abigail was helping little Matthew tie his loose bootlaces. The boy grinned. "Miss Harper." "Yes?" Mr. Walker smiles a lot now. "He certainly does. I think you fixed him." Abigail shook her head. "No, Matthew." "God did. I only told him the truth." The little boy nodded thoughtfully. "My uncle says truth can hurt." "It can. But sometimes," she gently patted his shoulder, "it's the only thing that can heal." The music softened. A slow fiddle melody drifted through the evening air. Ethan took a deep breath. His heartbeat echoed louder than the music. He walked across the meadow. People gradually noticed. Conversations slowed. Children stopped running. Old Ben quietly removed his hat. Pastor Samuel smiled without saying a word. Margaret clasped her hands together. Ethan stopped a few feet from Abigail. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The world seemed wonderfully still. Finally, Ethan extended his hand. "Miss Harper." She looked into his eyes. Gone was the guarded man who had hidden behind polite smiles. Standing before her was someone entirely different. Still humble, still gentle, but free. He smiled. "Would you honor me with this dance?" A warm smile spread across Abigail's face. "I would be honored." She placed her hand in his. As they walked toward the dance floor, applause quietly spread through the crowd. Not loud applause, gentle applause, the kind that comes when people witness God's faithfulness. They danced beneath the lanterns as stars slowly appeared overhead. Neither hurried to speak. The moment itself seemed precious. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I've imagined this conversation many times. And I never imagined it would happen." She smiled. "Neither did I." He looked into her eyes. "You once told me that if I wanted someone to know my story, I would tell them. I remember." So I'd like to tell you something now. She nodded. I'm listening. You changed my life. She shook her head. No, you chose to change. I simply held up a mirror. He smiled. Perhaps. But God used you. You were the first person who looked beyond the cowboy everyone admired. You saw the frightened boy I'd been hiding. A tear slipped down Abigail's cheek. You were never weak, Ethan. You were wounded, and wounded people deserve compassion, not condemnation. The music came to an end, but neither of them moved. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. Old Ben noticed immediately. His eyes widened. Pastor, I think this is it. Pastor Samuel smiled. I believe you're right. Ethan slowly removed a small velvet pouch. Inside rested a simple gold ring. It wasn't expensive, but it had belonged to his mother. He had carefully preserved it all these years. He looked at Abigail. My mother once told me, when God sends the right woman into your life, you'll know because she won't only love your strengths. He paused. She'll have the courage to stand beside your weaknesses. His voice trembled. You did exactly that. He slowly knelt on one knee. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Abigail Harper, for years I believed fear was my companion. You showed me that God's love is greater than fear. You reminded me that my past doesn't decide my future. You pointed me back to the Lord when I had almost forgotten how to trust Him. He opened the small ring box. I cannot promise a life without storms. I cannot promise there will never be sorrow. But I promise this. I will pray with you. I will walk beside you. I will honor you. I will choose you every day God gives us. Will you marry me? Abigail covered her mouth as tears streamed freely down her face. For several moments she couldn't speak. Finally she whispered, yes. Then louder, yes. With all my heart, yes. The crowd erupted into joyful applause. Children cheered. Women embraced one another. Several rugged cowboys discreetly wiped tears from their eyes. Old Ben laughed so hard he nearly cried. I've been waiting 26 years to see that. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, beneath the same giant oak tree, where Ethan and Abigail had often shared quiet conversations. The valley gathered early that morning. Wildflowers lined the wooden aisle. Simple white ribbons fluttered gently in the summer breeze. The church choir sang hymns celebrating God's faithfulness. Pastor Samuel stood beneath the oak with his Bible in hand. When Abigail walked down the aisle beside her mother, the entire congregation rose. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Old Ben leaned over and whispered, It's all right, son. Real cowboys cry too. The guests chuckled softly. After exchanging vows, Pastor Samuel addressed the gathering. Many people believed this story began when Ethan asked Abigail to dance. He smiled. But it began much earlier. It began the day one woman loved him enough to tell him the truth. He looked toward the congregation. Real love does not flatter. It does not manipulate. It does not hide. Real love points people toward Christ. Because only Jesus can heal what fear has broken. Amen, the congregation answered together. Years passed. The Walker Ranch became known throughout Wyoming for something far more valuable than cattle. Its doors were always open. Travelers found warm meals there. Widows received firewood during harsh winters. Struggling ranchers borrowed horses without interest or repayment demands. Most importantly, children without families found a home. Daniel, Luke, and Matthew never left. When their uncle passed away several years later, Ethan and Abigail welcomed the boys as their own sons. Soon, other orphan children arrived. Some stayed for weeks, others for years. Every child heard the same words on their first night. You are safe here. You are loved. You are never alone. The ranch grew into more than a business. It became a refuge, a place where broken hearts discovered hope. One quiet autumn evening, many years later, Ethan and Abigail sat together on the porch, watching grandchildren play beneath the fading sunlight. Matthew, now a grown man with children of his own, walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He smiled. "Do you know what people still say in town?" Ethan laughed. "I'm almost afraid to ask." "They still tell the story of the lonely cowboy every woman wanted." Abigail smiled knowingly. Matthew continued, "But they've changed the ending." "Oh?" "They don't say a woman won his heart. They say—" Matthew looked lovingly at both of them. "One fearless woman spoke the truth, and God used that truth to save an entire family." Ethan reached for Abigail's hand. After all the years, he still held it with quiet gratitude. He looked toward the endless Wyoming horizon, glowing beneath the setting sun. Then he softly quoted the verse that had carried him through every season of healing. "Perfect love drives out fear." Abigail rested her head against his shoulder. "It truly does." The prairie breeze whispered through the tall grass. Children laughed in the distance. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the mountains. And the lonely cowboy, who had once believed love was too dangerous, smiled as he watched the family God had graciously given him. For he finally understood the truth that had taken a lifetime to learn. Fear builds fences around the heart. Faith opens the gate. And when truth is spoken with love, God can lead even the most wounded soul into a life more beautiful than they ever dared to imagine. Moral of the story: people often admire strength without realizing the pain hidden beneath it. Genuine love is not about winning someone's attention or changing them by force. It is about having the courage to speak truth with compassion, to point one another toward God, and to trust Him to do the healing. When fear no longer rules the heart, God's love can transform not only one life, but generations to come.